There we go. So welcome everyone to Modern Dissent. And I'm just here to introduce what we're about a bit at Modern Dissent, and also, as Alex mentioned, why firstly we were wanted to have Nigel as a speaker, but also some of the difficulties we've faced in that endeavour. So to give Nigel's full introduction, I will just do that now. So yes, Nigel Biggar, CBE, is Emeritus Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, post in which he served from 2007 to 2022. He's also an ordained Anglican priest, and he's the author of the acclaimed books In Defense of War, What's Wrong with Rights, and most recently, the book we're all here for, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Now, so that book, and there's quite a saga in the creation of that book that's quite revealing about sort of the reason that we're doing Modern Dissent in a way. So I'm just going to begin at the beginning. And Nigel, do correct me if I get any of these details wrong, but hopefully I'll be right. So it was in 2017 that Nigel turned being a moral theologian and ethicist, turned his ethical scrutiny on the question of the British Empire. And that was in his project he launched, an academic project called Ethics and Empire, in which he would be a 5-year-long academic project in which he'd set out to investigate the goods and ills of the British Empire and colonialism. And when this came to the attention of the media, let's say, and people at Oxford University, he was swiftly, majorly denounced firstly by student protests, then by other professors, and also indeed by his own university department, which was Oxford's Centre for Global History, which, maybe they didn't quite denounce it, but they certainly they distanced themselves very publicly from that endeavour and said, we don't want to have anything to do with this because it's too divisive and all of those kinds of words. But nevertheless, Ethics and Empire carried on. And it is rather hot in here, so that's one of the downsides of this venue. But so Ethics and Empire carried on. And Nigel also was offered the chance to write about Ethics and Empire in a book, and that was by Bloomsbury. And this was in 2018. So duly, Nigel wrote the book and handed it in, I believe you said it was 8 hours before the deadline in 2020, which was 9 hours, right, very good. And this was, I think, December 2020, something like this. And when he handed it in, he was told by his commissioning agent that it was I will quote what he said. "I consider this to be a book of major importance, certainly one of the most important on my list for some time. Your research is exhaustive. I am speechless. Your argument is conveyed with care and precision. I say again, this is such an important book." And he predicted sales of 15,000 to 20,000 copies. This was early 2021, and of course that is about 9 months into the outpouring of let's say public moralism that was the so-called racial reckoning after the Black Lives Matter movement exploded onto the world stage really in June 2020. And so once with that having been said by the lowly commissioning editor, then there was a bit of a pause, and then Bloomsbury came back to Nigel and decided that actually, and this was someone higher up in the organisation, quote, we are of the view that conditions are not currently favourable to publication. So this book that was going to be groundbreaking, was going to sell many copies, was now no longer to be published by Bloomsbury. And I believe you, Nigel, tried to question why that was. And ask them, could they explain what these particular conditions were that made it so unfavourable? Whose opinions was it to whom it was so offensive? All of this kind of thing, and they basically wouldn't do it. And so the book was put on ice by Bloomsbury, and Nigel had to find another publisher, but more fool Bloomsbury because he did find another publisher, and it was published by William Collins in 2023, last year, and it became a Sunday Times bestseller, as had been predicted. And so, obviously, that made Nigel's name even more so than it already had been the Ethics and Empire project. And that's one reason why we wanted to have Nigel on as a speaker in Modern Dissent. That's what we're doing here. We're about having people who perhaps have have an important things to say that are countercultural and that you may offend various sensibilities, but nevertheless have are important things. And so, just a little bit about the past events in modern dissent. So our first one was in February with Professor Eric Kaufman. Many of you will have been there, not all of you, but and that was at Conway Hall, which is just down the road in Red Lion Square. And so Eric Kaufman is also a non-politically correct academic, as is Professor Biggar, and we were told before hosting him that we would have to get security to, in case, lest there be sort of left-wing protesters of various kinds who had, students at his university had previously told him, or had previously campaigned against him from 2 or 3 years previously, and that was apparently sufficient for us to need security. Now, security was not needed. No one turned out to protest the event, and in fact, quite ridiculously, the security guard didn't actually turn up. But anyway, so the event was fine. It was an hour-long lecture by Professor Kaufman on his new book, Taboo, which is actually finally coming out. So it was a world-first preview of that book. And, it was a very stimulating lecture. There were very, perspicacious questions put to him at the end. And it all went well as far as we were concerned. So we thought, okay, right, let's go back to Conway Hall for our next speaker. So we were arranging with Nigel, had the idea of him coming on. And we had, as many of you will know, we had the date down as 13th of June with Conway Hall. And then, so about 2 weeks before we were due to start this event, we got an email from Conway Hall, and it was a rather mealy-mouthed email, but I'll just read out the first line. So, concerns have been raised about the content of some of your events, and we do not feel that they are in accordance with our venue hire policy and can no longer be held at Conway Hall. So it was, it was curtain to the event. There was nothing we could do, and so, well, here we are now. We've had to rebook the event. We've had to, admittedly, this is actually a much nicer venue than Conway Hall. So in some ways, every cloud has a silver lining. But these, and needless to say, we did ask them, could you actually specify, what were those concerns? Who raised the concerns? Was it just one person? And was it about Eric Kaufman's lecture? Was it about the lecture we're about to hear tonight? We have no idea what the problem supposedly was, but nevertheless, that event was cancelled very unceremoniously, and we can't ever go back to Conway Hall, apparently. So, thanks for that. But so all of this to say, the point of modern dissent, and the point of this lecture tonight, partly is, not just to hear Nigel speak, but to hear, dissenting views that cut against the grain of this very censorious public morality that people don't like to, apparently, hear any dissent to. And so, so that's why we're very pleased to have Professor Biggar here tonight, and he's going to be speaking for us about deconstructing decolonisation. And finally, there's one more thing I need to say, which is that, yes, so it'll be about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll keep questions for the end. But yes, we're very looking forward to hearing the questions, because that is the whole idea of modern dissent. But without further ado, I give you Professor Nigel Biggar.
So, thanks, Laurie and Alex, for inviting me. I would never have discovered this place if I hadn't been invited here, so I'm glad for that. I don't plan to speak beyond 8:30, so we have at least half an hour for you to tell me what you think. I'm not going to talk about my trials and tribulations. If you want to ask about them, I can tell you more about those. I'm not going to talk directly about the book, although much of what I say will be drawn from it. But if you want to ask me directly about the book, you can do that too. Deconstructing Decolonisation. In October 22, the acting Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, Dr. Anthony Freeling, made a confession, which was reported in the press. He confessed that he was baffled by decolonisation. The word, he said, and I quote, has been misused to such an extent that I don't think, if I'm honest, I can give an accurate definition. Well, I don't know if it's been misused, but the truth is, yes, it can mean a variety of things. And one thing I'll do in the course of what I have to say is to analyse the different things it can mean, to tell you which ones make good sense to me, and then focus on the important one that makes very bad sense indeed. So, starting with the good sense. The original and most natural home of decolonisation, of course, is in former British colonies. There it can mean something entirely reasonable. So, for example, in 1986, the Kenyan novelist and playwright Ngugi wa Thiong'o published a book with the title Decolonising the Mind. And in this book he argued that African literature should be written in African languages, such as his own Gikuyu. Why? So that Africans can recover a sense of self-respect and stop being enthralled to the assumption that whatever comes out of Europe is better. To which the only sensible response can be, yes, of course. Although if you write in Gikuyu, you limit your market. But generally speaking, of course. When translated out of its original post-colony context into contemporary Britain, decolonisation can still make some good sense. It can mean correcting the neglect in school curricula of the history of immigration from the Caribbean, Africa, or Asia, and of the contribution of immigrants to this country. Or it can mean that important texts that have been excluded from reading lists in schools and universities just because of prejudice against the race of their authors should be included. If it's true that the history of immigration and the multicultural reality of Britain has been neglected, if it's true that important texts have been excluded just because of the colour of the author's skin, then curricula should indeed be decolonised. If those things are true, and have been shown to be true. So far, so much good sense. Less reasonable, however, is the opposition of decolonisers to Eurocentricity and their insistence on shifting attention to non-European histories and cultures. On the contrary, I think, a certain Eurocentricity in British education is absolutely justified. Britain is not anywhere. We are located in Northwest Europe, we have a particular history, and we have developed a particular set of institutions and traditions. It is vitally important, therefore, that school education, at least, should focus on helping budding citizens understand the immediate cultural and political environment in which they stand and for which they are about to become directly responsible. We are not anywhere, we're here. Now, of course, once in university, students can throw off Eurocentricity to their heart's content and immerse themselves completely in African culture, Indian history, and Chinese language, if they so wish. Equally unreasonable, I think, is the claim that school and university reading lists should contain an ethnic diversity of authors so that an ethnic diversity of students can identify with them. Now, I'm not quite sure about this, but in what I'm about to say there is truth. And I say it because it seems to me to be manifestly untrue that people of a certain race can only relate to, understand, be inspired by, and learn from someone of the same race. White Britons had been admiring the Semitic Jesus for 2 millennia and the Indian Mahatma Gandhi for over a century. And about 10 years ago, I was sitting on High Table in Christchurch, Oxford, and I was surrounded by a merry troupe of Shakespearean players from Kabul. They were Afghan, and apparently they got Shakespeare. So much so they spent their lives enacting him. So most happily, we really aren't intellectually imprisoned in racial silos. The only qualification I'd make is that there may be an argument that, perhaps particularly in secondary school, if you have a class full of ethnically Pakistani kids, to be able to give them someone they recognize from their own culture might help them identify with what's going on. I don't know. I've not studied the evidence on that, but it's certainly true that in terms of what we can appreciate in history and literature, we're not racially siloed. And another final unreasonable, dangerous decolonizing view is one that identifies reason, scientific method, and the liberal values of tolerance and free speech as Eurocentric, and therefore manifestations of an oppressive Western hegemony that deserves to be pulled down. How much good sense does that make, do you think, to the ethnically Chinese students who put their lives and liberty at risk in fighting for liberal rights in Hong Kong 4 or 5 years ago? And what exactly is the alternative to reason and tolerance other than arbitrary force? This anti-rational decolonization is the handmaid of authoritarian politics. All that by way of clearing the stage for what I really want to talk about. What I really want to talk about is the kind of decolonization that should worry us most. And it's the one that tells this story. The story is, Britain is a systemically racist country. Our racism is rooted in our colonial past, which we continue to celebrate, not least in the form of public statues, for example, Cecil Rhodes on Oxford's High Street. And the epitome, the essence of this colonial past was slavery, in which Britons treated Africans as subhuman. This view of Africans as subhuman then expanded into a wholesale disparagement of non-white cultures. Therefore, we need to exorcise, to expel this lingering racist mentality by repudiating Britain's colonial heritage. Now, I call this the cultural revolutionary decolonizing story. And I regard it as a false story because every one of its main assumptions, I think, is wrong. Now, I'll explain why I think it's wrong in a moment, but let me try and persuade you why you should care. Because there are lots of folk, both on the left and the right, who think that the present culture war is either a mendacious distraction or a futile one. And I couldn't disagree more strongly. In my view, the colonial front in the culture war is culturally crucial, and since politics is downstream of culture, it is politically crucial too. Why? Because what's at stake is the self-confidence of the British and their identity as a people committed to support and promote a liberal international order. You've heard me speak for 10 minutes now. Which part of the country do I come from? Hands up. Any idea? What? Who said that? Why do you say that? Okay, good, you're right. All right, good. So if I say the word Jerusalem, you can hear it. Okay. Point being, in 2014 we had a referendum on Scottish independence. As an Anglo-Scot, born of a Scottish father, English mother, educated on both sides of the border, I was a natural unionist and a natural opponent of Scottish independence. But I felt morally obliged to look at the arguments in favour of independence just to see if I was wrong. And one of the arguments in favour of independence that I came across can be reduced to this equation. Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, Scotland needs to separate from the United Kingdom in an act of national self-purification and slough off the tired, old, morally compromised post-imperial Britain and sail off into a bright, new, shiny, sin-free Scottish future. And I knew enough about imperial history, British imperial history, which I've been reading since the 1990s, to know that the equation empire equals evil is not historically tenable. But at that point, I realized colonial history is politically potent. It's being used for political purposes, which I regarded as destructive, and the story being told is also false. And that was the original germ of the inspiration for me to write a book on colonialism, actually. Then, of course, as alluded to earlier by Laurie, in 2020, May 2020, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. Black Lives Matter experienced an upsurge in support in the US. It then crossed the Atlantic, landed here, and the BLM narrative is essentially the decolonizing narrative that I explained earlier. And again, its political importance is it lies in the assumption that Britain is a systemically racist country, and that influences, it could influence policy, and in the policies of an incoming Labour government, it is more likely to influence policies, which, if they are based on false assumptions, are not going to be good policies. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why I think you should care. This is politically important stuff for this country. So let me explain what I think is wrong with the three main assumptions of the cultural revolutionary decolonising story. These assumptions are: first, Britain is systemically racist; second, this racism is rooted in British colonialism and its epitome slavery; and third, this racism manifested itself in a wholesale disparagement of the cultures of non-white peoples and the unwanted imposition of European culture upon them. So first, is Britain systemically racist? I'm not an expert on race relations in Britain, but I can read and I can see. I see empirical reasons to doubt whether Britain is systemically racist. I'll give you some. First of all, there is the visible fact of the skin colour of our present Conservative Prime Minister. Then there is the skin colour of most of Boris Johnson's last cabinet, whose members were drawn from the Middle East, Asia and Africa. I just suggest to you, if Britain was systemically racist, if we were indeed a white supremacist country, that wouldn't happen. It really wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen in the American South when it really was white supremacist. But I grant you, those are perhaps anecdotes. What about hard social scientific data? Well, we had the report of the Government Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparity in March 21. Were there 10 commissioners, 9 of whom were not white? And the gist of the report was that even if Britain does contain elements of racism, even institutional racism, we are not generally systemically racist. And indeed, we have made remarkable strides in the last 50 years in terms of transcending racism, so much so that when we end up with an ethnically Indian Prime Minister, it is, amongst people like us, completely unremarkable, which is how it should be. Now, the Cred report was controversial, and I followed its fate in the pages of the Guardian newspaper, and it was widely dismissed. But if you want to dismiss the Sewell report, the Cred report, then maybe you'll pay attention to the 2018 report of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, being black in the EU. This found that the prevalence of racist harassment as perceived by people of African descent was lower in the UK than in any EU country bar Malta. And the prevalence of overall racial discrimination was lowest in the UK bar none. So I think there are at least good reasons to doubt that the first assumption of the revolutionary decolonising story is true. And there are plenty of people with non-white skins who will tell you that. You may have noticed last year there were two books, both by non-white Britons, Tomi Owolade's This Is Not America, and Rakib Ehsan's Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. And Ehsan identifies himself as a man of the left. Both of those books essentially argued along the same lines as the Cred report. In fact, Owolade recounts that when he came to this country, I think to UCL from Nigeria, to study literature, he found all his white peers were obsessing about racism. And he looked around, he said, "Where is it? Where is it?" Couldn't see it. Couldn't experience it. Okay, so I think there are reasons to doubt that Britain is systemically racist. What about the second assumption that such racism as persists in Britain today is rooted in British colonialism and the epitome of colonialism, slavery? Well, the basic problem with that is that you cannot identify British colonialism with slavery. I mean, yes, some of us, some of our ancestors rather, were involved in slave trading and slavery between 1650 and 1807. But in the late 1700s, this country experienced something of a moral revolution, which was very popular, according to which enslaving other people became morally repugnant. And so the movement for the abolition of slavery was founded in 1787. In 1791, a petition to Parliament was so popular that 20%, it's estimated 20% of the male population of the country signed it. Now, this is long before mass democracy, and this is the 1700s. And so Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish slave trading and slavery. France abolished it in 1793, but then abolished slave trading in 1793, but then Napoleon reversed that 10 years later. Denmark abolished slave trading in 1804, Britain 1807, but then Britain, triumphant at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, then deployed her imperial power to suppress slavery worldwide, from Brazil across Africa, India, Malaysia to New Zealand, for the second half of the empire's existence from 1807 to 1960. Therefore, you cannot equate colonialism with slavery, because the British Empire spent the second half of its life invested in anti-slavery. And one mark of this discontinuity between the first and second halves of the empire is the witness of African Americans in the 19th century. The American historian of abolition, John Stauffer, has written, and I quote, "Almost every United States black who traveled in the British Isles acknowledged the comparative dearth of racism there. Frederick Douglass, the famous black abolitionist, noted after arriving in England in 1845, and I quote, 'I saw in every man a recognition of my manhood and an absence, a perfect absence, of everything like that disgusting hate with which we are pursued in the United States.' And just over a century later, Desmond Tutu had a similar experience when he first came to Britain from South Africa in the 1960s. According to his obituary in the Times newspaper in December of 21, I think, and I quote, "It was in Britain that Tutu first began to realize the intrinsic evil of apartheid. Police officers were polite, white people did not take precedence in queues. He visited Lord's, the Royal Albert Hall, and the Travellers' Club in Pall Mall. He lost the sense of inferiority most black South Africans felt in the presence of whites. And he lost it here." Now, let me be absolutely clear, I'm not saying that the British Empire did not contain elements of ugly, racist contempt for native peoples. It certainly did, but more at the colonial periphery than at the imperial centre, and more among settlers and planters than among colonial officials or missionaries. Nevertheless, the worldwide suppression of slavery was a major policy of the imperial centre, which was sustained for a century and a half and was premised on the principle of the fundamental human equality of all races, regardless of cultural development. And that principle found further central expression when, at the end of the First World War, the Imperial War Graves Commission committed itself to the equal treatment of all the empire's fallen troops in the commemoration of their sacrifice, regardless of the colour of their skin. If you visit Ypres and stand under the Menin Gate, you will see the names of thousands of men cascading down the walls. And there are Indian names there too, undifferentiated. And if you go to the cemetery at Noyelles-sur-Mer, where the burials of members of the Chinese Labour Corps are marked by individual headstones, you'll find exactly the same kind of marking of their deaths as you'll find in cemeteries containing Britons. So, I don't think Britain is systemically racist. You cannot ascribe whatever racism persists among us to colonialism, because the second half of the empire's life was devoted to anti-slavery based on the premise of human equality. Which brings us to the third assumption of the revolutionary decolonising story, namely that British colonial racism manifested itself in a wholesale disparagement of the cultures of non-white peoples and in the unwelcome imposition of white culture upon them. Can I just say, I mean, all of these issues are very complicated. The empire lasted 400 years and stretched from Newfoundland to New Zealand. I'm having to simplify the detail. If you want the detail, there's a book you could buy. That was quite subtle, wasn't it? So let's just begin by remembering that human cultures are constantly in the business of learning and borrowing from each other. They don't sit in racial silos, hermetically sealed against one another. For example, the religion that has done most to shape European culture, Christianity, was not invented in Europe. It arose in the Middle East among a Semitic people who did not speak a Romance or Teutonic or Slavic language and whose skin colour was not pink. And when the British and other missionaries brought a Europeanized version of that Semitic religion to Africa, they did not have the power to impose it. But they didn't have to, since, partly because of its message of the brotherhood of man and equality in Christ, Christianity proved naturally attractive to African refugees, slaves, children, marginalized adults such as women, and repressed teenagers such as girls fleeing compulsory circumcision. Yet, unsurprisingly, if Africans adopted Christianity, they also adapted it. They didn't swallow the European version wholesale and passively, they acted upon it, Africanized it. Famously in Kenya, many African Christians refused to accept the European missionary prohibition on polygamy, and so they set up their own independent African churches. Human cultures are constantly giving and taking, adopting and adapting. So to divide the world into simplistic, static, white and black cultural blocks is just not intelligent. Far from being contemptuous of the foreign cultures they found themselves, British Empire builders were often fascinated by them. Take one example, about 60 miles east of where I was born in Scotland, at a town called Ecclefechan. In 1769, a tenant farmer gave birth to John Malcolm. Because said tenant farmer had, I think, 17 children, he couldn't feed them all. So at age 11, young John travels from Ecclefechan to London, signs up for the Madras Army of the East India Company, and age 12 sails eastward he spent the next 30 years in India. He became fascinated by Persia. He learnt Farsi. He led 3 embassies to the Shah of Persia. He then wrote a 2-volume history of Persia that we know Goethe took out of the Weimar State Library twice, and which is still considered worthy of republication by Cambridge University Press 10 years ago. Malcolm, far from being contemptuous of the native cultures he came across, was fascinated. And indeed, far from suppressing native cultures in India, according to the Indian man of letters Neeraj Chowdhury, the British recovered them, because in rescuing classical Sanskritic civilization from oblivion, people like Warren Hastings and Sir William Jones, and I quote Chowdhury, rendered a service to Indian and Asiatic nationalism which no native could ever have given. At one stroke, it put the Indian nationalist on a par with his English ruler. It gave him the material out of which to build the historical myth of a Hindu civilization that was superior to Europe's. But then, if some Britons were keen to rescue Sanskritic culture, some Indians were just as keen to jettison it. In 1823, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a Hindu social progressive, wrote to Lord Amherst, the Governor-General of India, to protest against the East India Company's policy of supporting traditional Sanskrit learning, which Roy described as the best calculated to keep this country in darkness. Instead, Roy urged the British to promote the education of, quote, the natives of India in mathematics, natural philosophy, chemistry, anatomy, and other useful sciences, which the nations of Europe have carried to a degree of perfection that has raised them above the inhabitants of other parts of the world. Now, Roy was not entirely happy with the British ruling India, but he recognized the value of the cultural gifts they brought. And note here, it was the British who wanted to invest in classical indigenous Indian culture, while the progressive Indian dismissed it as benighted, urging instead that Indians need to be allowed to share in modern European enlightenment. Just to end Roy's story, decades later, Roy came to England to lobby in favour of the East India Company's banning of sati, the Indian custom whereby widows burn themselves alive in the funeral pyres of their deceased husbands. And in fact, Roy died in Bristol, where he lies buried and where a statue was raised to him in 1997. Now, again, I'm not saying that in addition to elements of bona fide curiosity and admiration, the British Empire didn't contain elements of cultural repression, born of political fear or of racist contempt. I think here of the repression of Gaelic culture in Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. Nonetheless, these need to be distinguished in a way that loose talk of cultural genocide does not distinguish from well-intentioned policies of native assimilation to British culture. When the people of one culture meets another and dominates it overwhelmingly in number and power, only 3 outcomes are possible. Either the dominant people annihilates the dominated one, or the latter adapts and assimilates, or the 2 peoples separate. Either annihilation, or assimilation, or separation. Separation, that is to say, apartheid. British colonial settlement did sometimes inadvertently cause the annihilation of a native people, as in the case of the Beothuk of Newfoundland. The third option, separation, of which Afrikaner apartheid or separateness was a version, was never British imperial policy. Whether in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or South Africa, that policy was basically assimilation, even when provisional separation was countenanced. The egalitarian view that native people were essentially equal to Britons, possessed of the equal potential to develop economically and culturally, predominated in the imperial metropolis, even when some settlers on the colonial periphery doubted it. Policies of assimilation usually involve such things as the creation of land reserves, the provision of native schools, and the promotion of agriculture. The goal of assimilation was the full integration of natives into European society as equal citizens. Therefore, black Africans were granted the vote on the same terms as whites in 1853. Now, on the same terms as whites meant that by the 1890s only a small African electorate existed, but it was enough to be decisive in some constituencies in parliamentary elections in South Africa. In New Zealand, all adult Maori males were granted the vote in 1867. And I'm sure I've read this, I need to go check it because it sounds so unlikely, but they were granted the vote before whites. I'm sure I've read that. In Canada, Indians, native Canadians, were granted the vote in 1885. Unhappily, 10 years later, the vote was taken from them by a Liberal Premier because the natives were all voting Tory. Okay, so as I see it, the cultural revolutionary decolonising story is wrong in every one of its main assumptions. Britain today is not systemically racist. Indeed, it appears to be one of the least racist countries in Europe. Secondly, such racism as does persist among us is not rooted in British colonialism, which spent the second half of its life committed to anti-slavery out of the Christian conviction of the basic human equality of all races. And third, British imperialists were not generally inclined to rubbish the cultures of non-white peoples, and non-white peoples were not generally inclined to resent what the British brought them. Often they welcomed it, even while they adapted what they adopted. So, the revolutionary decolonising story about Britain's systemically racist present and its centrally racist colonial past is a false story, and it should not be allowed to corrode faith in Britain's future and infect British foreign policy with imaginary guilt. So before I move to conclude, let me just comment on a current political expression of the decolonising story, which displays its character as a moral melodrama performed in stark divisions, black versus white, oppressed versus oppressor, good versus evil. And this has to do with the current conflict in Gaza. The day after Hamas's atrocious attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year, University of Kent lecturer Dr. Shahid Hamouri asserted online that, quote, resistance by the Palestinian people by all means available is a legitimate act. 2 months later on Al Jazeera, she invoked Israel's settler colonialism in justification. Quote, Israel is a colonizing power and the Palestinians the colonized indigenous population. So notice the stark, melodramatic opposition. Bad Israeli settlers, poor Palestinian victims, which justifies the use of all means available, unrestricted violence. So that's the melodrama. Here's the complicated historical truth, and there's a section of my book that I devote to the issue of Palestine. Before 1914, Jewish corporations bought Palestinian land from Arab landlords to settle thousands of Zionist immigrants. Why were Zionists immigrating to Palestine? Many of them were Russians fleeing pogroms in Russia. They were refugees. Now, because of Zionism's ethnic character, and because people do naturally prefer living among those they trust, being culturally familiar, the immigrants naturally preferred building their settlements with fellow Zionists. Accordingly, they let go of Arab tenants who had tilled the land for generations. Naturally, the Arab tenants resented this. But what the Zionists did was perfectly legal. even if the effect was tragic. But whatever moral assessment you make of that, invasion it was not. This is not a stereotypical invasion of settlers. In 1917, the British government made the Balfour Declaration, pledging to establish, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine without prejudice to the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. And the motives were several. One of them was sympathy for the Zionist story of an exiled people yearning to return home. It's widely believed that the declaration betrayed a promise made in 1915 to Hussein, Sheriff of Mecca, that Britain would establish an Arab state encompassing Palestine. But if you read the work of the Baghdad-born Jewish historian Eli Kaduri, his book In the Anglo-Arab Labyrinth, published in 1976, I warn you, it's dense, but I followed it, and I think he argues persuasively, the British made no promise to include Palestine in an Arab state. And the British did preside over the creation of two Arab states, which still exist, Jordan and Iraq. After the First World War, the League of Nations mandated Britain to administer Palestine toward building an independent state and a Jewish homeland out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. What kind of national home for Jews remained undetermined. During the mandate's quarter of a century, the British tried a variety of permutations to satisfy both Arab and Jew: a semi-autonomous Jewish province in an Arab state, a Jewish state in an Arab federation, and a binational state. But notwithstanding their long imperial experience of managing multicultural politics, the British underestimated the difficulty of constructing a viable polity out of cultures as divergent as those of largely urban European Jews and often peasant Levantine Arabs. No option proved mutually acceptable. British frustration was memorably expressed by Ronald Storrs, Governor of Jerusalem, when he wrote in his 1939 Orientations, and I quote, 2 hours of Arab grievance drive me into the synagogue, while after an intensive course of Zionist propaganda, I'm prepared to embrace Islam. Arab frustration had burst into violence in 1920 when the Nebi Musa riots left 5 Jews dead and 216 wounded. Further riots followed, culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936-9. While the immediate motive was anti-Zionist, it wasn't untainted by historic anti-Semitism. One instigator of the 1920 riots, who became the leader of Arab resistance, Haj Amin al-Husseini, ended up in Nazi Germany in 1938, whereas the left-wing historian Ilan Pappé coyly puts it, he confused the distinction between Judaism and Zionism. Responding to Arab grievances, the British considered restricting Jewish immigration in 1930, but decided against it out of sympathy for Jews fleeing anti-Semitism in Germany. When they did impose limits in 1939, the extremist Zionist terrorist group Lehi sought an alliance with Hitler to oust them. It's really complicated. Exasperated by their failure to broker a compromise and subject to increasing violence, the British unilaterally withdrew from Palestine in May 1948. In November, the UN voted to create 2 states, one Jewish, the other Arab. At that point, Jews occupied only 10% of the territory. But when invading Arab armies failed to crush the nascent Israel in 1948-9, some 750 Arabs fled Palestine, abandoning their land. Now, to what extent were they pushed? To what extent did they flee voluntarily? It's controversial. Ilan Pappé on the left reckons half were deliberately expelled. If you like, to use the incendiary term, there was the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by Jews. But there was the ethnic cleansing of Jews by Arabs, because the Jews were expelled from East Jerusalem when the Arabs occupied that part of the city, and a further 900,000 Jews felt sufficiently uncomfortable in the Middle East to flee to Israel. So there you have the whole, what I think is morally messy story about the founding of the State of Israel. You can find victims and villains on both sides, and you can find a lot of human tragedy. The cartoonish decolonizing narrative does not begin to do justice to the details of the past. And its cartoon authorizes unrestrained, even genocidal violence in the present. Just to suggest to you that there's a lot at stake in this history and the political uses to which it's put. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. I think the decolonizing emperor is pretty naked. And I think the political effects are often poisonous. Nevertheless, British university authorities are too often intent upon imposing decolonizing policies, and British academics are too often ready to adopt them. According to a 2022 report from the think tank Civitas, over half of universities in the UK are officially committed to undertake some form of decolonization. I don't have data more recent than that. Now, why is that? He asks. Why is that? Well, out of my own experience, I think there are three main causes. One is the political zeal of a few, riding on the back, second, of the historical ignorance of the many. It's not surprising. Most Brits know virtually nothing about imperial history. And then third, academics, most of them are terrified of being ill thought of by their peers, being branded racist or unprogressive. Never overestimate the moral courage of academics. We may be fiercely independent in the narrow fields of our scholarly expertise, but in general we are perfectly capable of behaving like sheep. So what's to be done about it? Well, the late Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, Louise Richardson, gave the lead in late 2021 when she, and I'm sorry to say she alone, called for more ideological diversity in our universities. She's been the one voice in among British universities, and she's now moved to America. We have to take the risk, I suggest to you, the risk of voicing our dissident doubts about decolonization and putting sceptical questions to it, for the reasons I've tried to explain. And if any professor or university manager slaps you down, protest your right to question a set of views that even the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge confessed he was baffled about. And if your own university won't support you, get in touch with the Free Speech Union. What's more, on the 1st of August, when the Higher Education and Freedom of Speech Act comes into force, universities and student unions will acquire a statutory duty to defend and promote academic freedom, and both students and professors will acquire the right to appeal against their own universities to the Office for Students if they believe that their freedom to dissent from a set of dubious social, scientific and historical views is not being upheld. I do think it's vital we take risks in asserting our legal right to doubt and interrogate the decolonizing story, because what's at stake is really very important. What's at stake, most of all, I think, is confidence in Britain as an important pillar of the liberal West and the liberal international order at a time when illiberal powers are baring their ruthless teeth. Think Ukraine. I mentioned Elie Kuduri a moment ago and his book on whether the British promised Palestine to the Arabs. In that book there's a remark I quote a lot. The reason that Kuduri wrote his book in 1976 was he observed that the British Foreign Office and its policy had been shaped by a sense of guilt over the betrayal of the Arabs. And so in his book he talks about imaginary guilt And he says, "The canker of imaginary guilt, even the greatest power can ill withstand." And the guilt, I think, that cultural revolutionary decolonisers would hoist upon us is largely imaginary. The decolonising emperor is almost entirely naked. So we need to stand up and say what we see. We need to break the spell. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that very interesting talk. My question is, isn't the reason why the capture has been so total in our institutions is because it's productive ground, because in a sense it's secularized Christianity regurgitating, because it's the excluded, the marginalized, the tax collectors, prostitutes historically, and that has been repeated now. And in terms of the good-evil distinction, is it not, can I give an example of something that could be said to be quite evil, and see what you think? Which is that every single colony that the British ever had, if you look carefully, has a separate political and economic centre, which was a deliberate policy so that we could divide and rule for longer.
Fine. So on the second question, I never heard that before, so I can't really comment. I'd be surprised if it was that deliberate, but okay. Yeah, okay. But then, so does the US. The US also has a separate political... Yeah, we did that. We did it. Yeah, but anyway, okay, fine. Yeah, I suspect it was more ad hoc than deliberate. Anyway. On the first thing, in terms of secularized Christianity, yes, there is certainly a kind... In trying to understand what drives the zeal of the decolonisers, I speak as a confessing Christian myself, so I recognise a religious believer when I see one. There's a zeal there which drives people, drives them, in my view, beyond reason. And yes, to be charitable, yes, a concern for the poor of the earth is a noble moral concern. But in fact, what you have is rather a kind of unbalanced Christian view, because that concern for the poor is not balanced by a sense of sin that runs through the champion of the poor as well as anyone else. So that there's a kind of mercilessness toward those who are regarded as the enemies of the poor. And by the way, a commitment to the poor of the world should not require you to tell untruths about the past. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Biggar, you mentioned early in your talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, which originated in the US, as we know, a killing that was in a very different milieu, if you like, very different circumstances, very different policing environment and so on, yet translated into concerns here about endemic racism and so on and so forth. Is that not a symptom of US cultural hegemony over this country? The way that what happens in the US tends to get reflected here rather than coming out of concerns that people have about racism. I mean, the whole background of African Americans and so on in the United States is very different to people from ethnic minorities in this country, where we didn't have, obviously, the plantation system in this country. I know we did in the West Indies, but not in this country. So it's a symptom of, if you like, US cultural colonialism, if I can put it like that.
I agree with you, and what's happened is that we have imported ideas about race from the US, but the fault is ours. Somehow, we, and this includes all our educated classes, overlooked the fact that we're not America. It took a 27-year-old Nigerian to write a book with the title, "This is Not America." So the question is, why did we swallow it? Partly, I guess, if you're a professional anti-racist, if you're in an anti-racist group, it's useful. So it's politically useful, this notion of critical race theory. But I still don't understand, I don't really quite understand why our media and our academics have bought it so uncritically. So yes, it's a symptom of American cultural dominance, but we're the ones who buy it. It's our fault.
Thank you. This is maybe more a question about what you probably address in the book, rather than, but it's about the morality of colonialism itself. In my understanding, at the dawn of the Age of Exploration, Europe was culturally and technologically much more advanced than other parts of the world. And we explored the world. We came in contact with civilizations that were quite far, without using loaded language, that were not developed technologically to the same extent. Now when we rethink colonialism and we think about the morality of it, how do we, if we could kind of wind back the clock to the Age of Exploration, us Europeans encountering other cultures, what should we have done differently? Should we have not embarked on the whole colonial project to begin with? Should we have done it but just been more moral about it? How should we morally assess it, and what should we have done differently?
Right, that's a very good question. So, it's quite difficult to answer because it kind of we're looking back from the situation in our world, wondering how, if we lived in our world, how would we behave then? The thing is that world was so different. So first of all, the cultural gap between Western Europe and the cultures that Europeans discovered in North America and Africa and Australia was vast. And that was just an accident of history. Secondly, when Europeans arrived, particularly in North America and Australia, they didn't initially go with the intention of settling in large numbers. Or India, for example, we went to trade. And then we got embroiled in conflicts between Indians, allying ourselves with one side against another, the East India Company, and then the East India Company gets rewarded with land. In South Africa, we got possession of Cape Town at the end of during the Napoleonic Wars, mainly as a naval base, but then one thing led to another. So things were very ad hoc. No one sat in London at one point and said, let's go and populate the world. It wasn't like that. And also, when Europeans arrived in North America or Australasia, although the land was not uninhabited, it was very sparsely inhabited, and there were often no clear borders. So to Europeans, it looked empty. So I think in order to judge what they did then, one needs to realize the very different circumstances that they experienced. But nowadays, of course, we wouldn't, as a rule, contemplate one people walking into another's territory and taking it over like Putin is doing in Ukraine. But the world wasn't like that then. So there. I don't know. Remember your number.
Okay. I'd be really interested in your reflection on, and excuse me for my ignorance of imperial history, but my understanding is a lot of governance in the empire was done through community leaders and through religious leaders, and them representing their communities. And in Britain, it seems that we've seemed to have adopted that as a mechanism of rule through the politics of multiculturalism, is relating to sections of society, particularly Muslims, through their community leaders, and in fact elevating them.
Yeah.
And I'd just be interested in your reflections on how much it's almost like an imperial form of governance, that our country is being governed as if it's a foreign country rather than our own country.
That's an interesting observation. So you're quite right. Not least because the numbers of Britons in Africa and India, the numbers were tiny. In India, in the year 1900, there were 300 million Indians and a total of 164,000 Brits, total, including military. So if the empire was to survive at all, it had to depend on buy-in from native peoples, and that usually meant, yes, in a sense, within certain parameters. I'm thinking of West Africa right now. The British were happy to leave African leaders who were selected, and sometimes the selection was imposed rather than from the ground up. But they were within certain parameters. They were allowed to get on with their lives as normal. And so, yes, I guess we are. Maybe I guess the point is to allow, rightly or wrongly, to allow different peoples to organise their own lives with relative autonomy. And to some extent, that sounds like a good thing, just provided that the autonomy is bounded by certain common laws and rules, so that although we have a freedom to do things somewhat differently, we are all, in some respects, playing by the same rules. And I guess the question is the extent of the autonomy that's granted to groups within the country. Yeah. I think there's...
Thank you. Nigel, I'm intrigued by what you say about academics and their moral courage, but also my question is, how can you account for the extraordinary monochrome nature of British universities now, as you've experienced it in terms of criticisms of your work? My memory of university, now a long time ago, is of very fierce debates in subjects like economics, where there were very, very clear different views and very public and sometimes quite bitter disputes about them. How has academia ended up in Britain so monochrome?
Yes, I'm sure that there are lots of issues on which we're not monochrome, and there are fierce debates, but certainly on issues of decolonisation, perhaps on trans issues, perhaps on race. This is speculation, really. I think ideas are pushed by a certain minority, often administrators, not academics. And academics, I certainly experienced this myself. The top of the university is constantly wanting you to do something new. Whenever it asks you to do something new, it never allows you to stop doing whatever else you were doing. So the new things constantly being added. And so one often has to think, am I going to fight this, or do I just try and work around it? And so a lot of academics just accept stuff they don't agree with, because partly they don't understand how important it really is, and because they look around and they say, is anyone else objecting? No, so I must be the only person in the room who objects. In fact, they're not. Most people in the room object, but no one is saying anything. So there's a certain calculation of prudence here, where on these issues, people don't care enough, don't see the importance of them enough to take the risks of voicing dissent. That's how I read it. So on these issues, we have become strangely monochrome. But I'm certainly on the colonial issue. I know that there are academics in Oxford who more or less agree with me. They've said, most of them have said so in private. That's the point, not in public.
Thank you. Question is, to what extent do you think a fact-based approach like yours is effective against what seems to be non-fact-based decolonisation movement driven by to be charitable a sort of worship of the oppressed, or uncharitable a sort of resentment of the West? And if you think something else is needed as well, do you have any ideas about what that might be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For a long time, I puzzled over how do you persuade zealots. I spent some fruitless evenings when I was young having conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses. I didn't get very far. At one point I read 2 biographies of members of the RA who had abandoned the cause, and 2 biographies of young British Islamists who'd seen the light and abandoned radical Islam, and I was wondering what made the difference. And in one case, in the case of an Islamist, what made the difference was he's talking to a scholar of Islam who displayed to him all the wonderful variety of things that Islam can be, and exposed that his own particular version was extremely narrow. Now, at the time, it made no difference, but that thought stuck in his head, and eventually the penny dropped. So that the conclusion I've drawn is partly that it might always be worthwhile just speaking the truth to someone who looks as if they're not listening, because they may actually absorb more than they appear to. But the other thing is, even if the person in your face is a zealot with fingers in his ears, there are 100 people watching you. You're addressing them. So beyond just trying to be reasonable and appealing to the facts, I don't know what else to do. But I think that can be effective. And I think even just being reasonable can be impressive. So in the postscript to the new postscript that I wrote in the paperback edition of my book, I devoted most of it to answering my 10 most hostile critics. Why? Well, because I thought I ought to show that I was willing to listen to what they had to say and answer them. And I ended up making 4 minor concessions. I'm glad I didn't have to make more than that, but I thought it was important to show that's how we should behave.
Yeah, can I say that postscript is a tour de force? I thoroughly enjoyed reading it in the paper.
Oh, thanks.
I thought it was an excellent example of how people should engage with, I'm not sure you can call them critics, I think in many ways you call them objectors to you. My question is, I agree with you very much about the dangers of decolonisation, particularly in a university setting when it gives the impression to many in the public that universities are increasingly run by enforced subversives and radicals. And I wonder how we deal with that in the long term, given the fact that most academics of various types are either left or left liberals. First is, how do we go about to ensure that viewpoint diversity is protected and enshrined? How do we broaden out the type of academic that comes into work in our universities? And secondly, how do we enforce things like the Claven principle of institution neutrality, making universities spaces, not platforms, in which truth in all its various forms trumps things like social justice, which is not the case at the present time?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. Yes. So the only answers I can give are, well, first of all, the good news is I think that a lot of the left progressivism of most of our academic colleagues is thin. It's not deeply convinced. But I think a lot of academics, that their political views are second-hand. So they could change. Secondly, I do think that the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act will make a difference. And I'm hoping that if the Act persuades institutions to change, to not council venues because they're not prepared to pay for security, for example. If the institutional environment becomes more friendly to open discussion, I'm pretty sure a lot of academics will warm to that, but they won't do anything about it until it happens to them. Yeah, that's the best I can do, really. If you've got any ideas, let me know.
So my question is, you talked a bit about how these ideas of the decolonisation narrative is propagated, but do you have any thoughts about how it started and for what reason?
Post-colonialism has existed in English lit departments as a kind of sexy new version of study of literature for a long time, and some parts of history departments. It appears as if BLM kind of shot them to the centre stage. So it was an accident of history, although the fact that BLM shot them to centre stage indicates that the ground was fertile, ready for that. And again, I think that it thrives partly because of the moral intuition that surely we should care for the wretched of the earth, and yes, aren't we privileged in this part of the world, which we are? And then combine that with an ignorance of imperial history. If people tell you that the poor of the earth are your fault or your ancestors' fault, then you don't have any means of contradicting them. But what puzzles me is that so many of us, and I'm thinking of middle-class, educated folk, the decolonizing narrative is something a lot of us want to believe. That's what puzzles me, because the response I've got, particularly from some historians and others, if you say something that contradicts what they believe, they could respond with skeptical curiosity. You say, Biggar says this. Why does Biggar say that? What are his reasons? Here's some counter reasons. That's not the response. Biggar says this, to quote Professor Priyam Vadagopal of Cambridge University, we need to shut this down, she says. Now, why? So there's something attractive about the decolonizing story. A lot of people want to buy into. And even if you present contrary evidence, they don't want to hear it. Because the story somehow, we all like being crusaders. We love to be on the right side of history. We love to be the righteous casting down the wicked. Are we in love with our crusading role? I regard that as a spiritual question, a spiritual issue. And some people have social and professional interests in this narrative.
It's a very quick question. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Did you sell more than the 15,000 that the Bloomsbury hoped you would?
I love that question. I'm delighted to say it has to date sold 60,000 copies. So another reason for hope. There is an appetite. There is an appetite out there. Although I do worry about what's being fed to school kids. Yep.
I'm an academic. I think I can answer your last point, as in why is it getting so much traction? I'll put it to you that actually there's very much less critical thinking capability amongst academics than we might dare to believe.
Yes, I think that's right. I remember talking to a doctoral student who was doing work on an Islamic social reform in Egypt in the late 1800s. And I was complaining about how historians I mean, I'm not a professional historian, I'm an ethicist. How historians don't seem to understand ethics. I mean, they do it whilst denying they're doing it, and then they look down their nose at me, who's doing it explicitly. And his response was, but you need to remember, historians aren't philosophers. They're not used to that kind of conceptual analysis. And certainly, I've noticed, so one point is that not every academic is trained to kind of analyse and argue. The other is that I've noticed, I quoted Priyambada Gopal, the professor of post-colonial literature in Cambridge. I read a book of hers called Insurgent Empire about the collaboration between native anti-imperialists and anti-imperialists in Britain. And I noticed how she constantly quoted Edward Said, the patriarch of post-colonialism, which is fine, except I noted she quoted him as if he was God himself. I mean, there wasn't a hint, not a hint, of criticism. And the reader would get no idea that Said's views are highly controversial. None. And I've seen that before. So in certain fields, there does appear to be a kind of strange kind of authoritarianism. What field do you work in?
I'm an engineer.
Okay. Are you free of these things?
We've not been asked to decolonise our curriculum yet.
No, it could come. I was talking to a zoologist in Oxford who tells me zoology in Oxford has been decolonised. I'm not sure how you do mathematics, but maybe, yeah, they'll try.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for the talk. And generally speaking, may I say that whenever there's a news story, maybe relating to this subject, where you're asked to make a statement and your name comes up, I often think, oh, thank goodness he's here. To not quite repeat, but to slightly related to the idea of narratives being pushed and mythologies, there seems to be an element in this movement, as it's progressed, of actively removing, if we simply remove English culture or English history from our universities and our institutions, almost the idea that there is a new mythological landscape will be revealed, where there were a multitude of people or influences from other cultures that have been here all along and they've just been suppressed. Whereas it seems if you just remove English history from England, there's nothing underneath, as it were. Yes, there's a story about folk music, which I think is trying to find some roots to English folk music, not by the natives. Do you think that this is largely where this movement is going? Is it becoming more prevalent, or?
Well, I mean, certainly it is. It tends to regard the Western culture as oppressive, and our sin has been to deny voice to non-Western cultures. So there is a tendency to downplay Western culture in universities, upplay other cultures, and yes, to behave as if this was cosmopolis, as if it's not appropriate for us here to privilege attention to British traditions or European traditions. I mean, I've no objection at all to paying attention to non-European traditions, but I think that should happen at university, not at school. You can't do everything at school, and I think it's important to prioritise educating Britons in how we got where we are here. But sometimes I feel as if these folk just hate Britain. But then I correct myself, well, maybe they don't hate Britain, they hate Britain as it is, and they want their vision is it is cultural revolution, and they want to erase the past and start from scratch. And history provides evidence that that's not a good idea.
Okay, very last question.
Yes, one last question, I think, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Thank you. It strikes me that England's oldest colony, Ireland, is very much overlooked by those who advocate decolonisation and the repudiation of decolonising culture. And I'm wondering why that is, because, I mean, leaving aside Ireland's somewhat troubled history in the last 100 years, it has been independent, and recently it's been extraordinarily successful. And is that a bit of a rebuke to the colonising narrative?
I hadn't thought of that. I mean, certainly, Ireland is an interesting case because it was kind of colonised and it wasn't. I mean, it was integral to Britain and still is. Northern Ireland still is integral. So I guess I would see it as a useful example just to mess up the kind of binary story of us versus them and colonised versus colonised. Because up until 1916, lots of Irish people called themselves British. In the same way that I'm British, but I'm also Scottish. Don't you forget it. So lots of Irish, not just from Northern Ireland, thought themselves as British. But because of the unhappy events of 1916 onwards, people had to choose. But even now, the identities are still messed up. So you go to Dublin, and the number of institutions that have the word royal in front of them, the Royal College of Surgeons, the Royal College of Yachting, or whatever it is, and yes, they painted their post boxes green, but they kept the post boxes. There's still the royal emblems on the front. I lived in Dublin for 4 years. So the relationship is a messy one, and nicely so. And Irish citizens can still serve in the British Army. So it's good for messing up this kind of cartoonish division of the world into black and white and good guys and bad guys.
Okay, great. So a very final question, the gentleman in the fantastic shirt.
Yeah, someone new to this. Do you think it's time to redefine the word colonialism? Because when I try to look for definitions, it always gives the impression of the greater power of the country. But I found one definition that just said it could be any sort of landmass or group of people that do it. And if that was the case, and that is the definition which I believe, colonialism and its evils could be is replicated throughout the world in every sort of country or sub-countries or on the continent of Africa especially. So I think that the word of colonialisation definitely needs to be redefined or clarified.
Yeah, well, no, you're quite right. The idea that Europeans invented colonialism is nonsense. I mean, it depends what you mean. I mean, certainly Europeans did not invent empire. But the phenomenon of one people pushing another people off the land or dominating other people is universal. Yes, the British South Africa Company in the 1890s ended up conquering southern Rhodesia, as it became, but then the Ndebele had only been in southern Rhodesia for 60 years when they came in and conquered the Shona. It doesn't mean the British were any better, but the phenomenon of one place, people displacing another, and the Zulu, of course, in the 1820s expanded an empire and sent African peoples scattering to the south and the west, and in the 1600s the Iroquois expanded and pushed the Huron off the Great Lakes, and so forth. I mean, no surprise. This is not a European phenomenon, and empire certainly is not. Nor is racism. Europeans did not invent racism. Just one anecdote. Well, two. One is there's a medieval Muslim philosopher who was observing the inferiority of European and African cultures relative to Arab Muslim culture in the medieval period. And he decided that the reason was that Europe, Northwest Europe, was too cold for people to be clever, and Africa was too hot. Second anecdote is in the 1940s, the Irish, an Irishman called Gerald Hanley, who went on to become a novelist after the war, was commanding British troops in Somaliland. And he discovered he couldn't persuade his Somali troops to obey their Bantu African sergeant. Why? Because the Somalis regarded the Bantu as natural slaves. Thank you very much. So racism, like group prejudice of any kind, is not particularly European.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. My apologies if I didn't get your question in. I think we got the vast majority, though. All that's left is for me to thank, and all of us to thank, Professor Nigel Biggar for his wonderful talk and answering his questions in a very thoughtful manner, I thought. Thank you.